I was a ghost in my own life until the night Ethan threw me out. Standing on the curb with nothing but a hastily packed bag, I watched through the window as my husband of 12 years celebrated with his mistress in our living room. My living room. Our neighbors drove past, averting their eyes from my humiliation. "You'll regret this," I had whispered as the door closed in my face. He laughed. What Ethan never bothered to check was whose name was actually on the deed. His mistake, my opportunity. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Mine would be methodical, calculated, and absolutely devastating. I may have left that night as a discarded wife, but I would return as something else entirely, the architect of his complete destruction. And I wouldn't stop until he lost everything. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. I never thought my life could change so drastically in a single evening. The drive home from work that day was like any other. I remember humming along to some pop song on the radio, mentally planning the chicken parmesan I'd make for dinner. Ethan loved my chicken parmesan. After 12 years of marriage, I knew all his favorites, the little things that kept our life comfortable, predictable. The first hint that something was wrong came when I pulled into our driveway. An unfamiliar red sports car was parked in my usual spot. I frowned, pulling up behind it and wondering if we had unexpected company. Ethan hadn't mentioned anyone coming over. Our suburban house looked the same as always. The gray siding, white, trim, and the flower boxes I'd planted last spring. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way the curtains were drawn in the living room when I usually left them open in the mornings. I grabbed my purse and the bag of groceries I'd picked up for dinner, juggling them as I made my way to the front door. The key turned easily in the lock and I pushed the door open with my hip. "Ethan, I'm home," I called out, the way I did every evening. I kicked off my heels and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen. That's when I noticed Ethan sitting at our dining table, his posture rigid. He didn't get up to help me with the groceries, didn't ask about my day. He just sat there staring at me with eyes that suddenly seemed to belong to a stranger. "Hey," I said, my smile faltering. "Everything okay?" "Sarah?" His voice was flat, emotionless. "We need to talk." I set the groceries on the counter, a chill running down my spine despite the warm spring evening. "What's going on?" "I want a divorce." 4 words. 4 simple words that shattered 12 years of marriage, countless memories, and every plan for our future. He delivered them the same way he might comment on the weather, casually, without emotion, as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb in our living room. "What?" I whispered, certain I'd misheard him. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" "I've been unhappy for a while now." He stood up, and I noticed he was wearing his expensive watch, the one I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. "I think we both know this isn't working anymore." "Both know?" My voice rose in disbelief. "I had no idea. Where is this coming from?" He sighed, as if my confusion was an inconvenience. "Look, I didn't want to drag this out. I've already talked to a lawyer. I'm filing the papers tomorrow." The kitchen seemed to spin around me. I gripped the counter to steady myself. "You've already talked to a lawyer? Without saying a word to me first?" "I need you to pack your things." He wouldn't meet my eyes now. "Tonight." "Tonight," I repeated, my mind struggling to process what was happening. "You can't be serious. This is my home too, Ethan. You can't just—" "Actually, he can." The new voice cut through my shock like a knife. I turned to see a young woman standing in the doorway to our living room. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long blonde hair and the kind of confident smile that only comes from getting exactly what you want. She was wearing yoga pants and one of Ethan's college sweatshirts, my husband's clothes hanging loosely on her slender frame. "Sarah, this is Vanessa," Ethan said, as if introducing a colleague at a business dinner. "What is she doing here?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "And why is she wearing your clothes?" Vanessa sauntered into the kitchen and placed a proprietary hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'm helping Ethan move forward with his life." She smiled, all white teeth and satisfaction. "He deserves to be happy, don't you think?" The realization hit me like a physical blow. You're having an affair. Ethan didn't deny it. He just shrugged, as if my accusation was irrelevant. Vanessa and I are together now, and she's moving in. Tonight. Tonight? My voice came out as a strangled cry. You're kicking me out of my own house for her? Tonight? The house is in my name, Ethan said coldly. And yes, tonight. I've packed some of your essentials. As if on cue, Vanessa disappeared down the hallway and returned with my old duffel bag, the one I used for weekend trips to visit my mother before she passed away. She dropped it at my feet with a thud. This isn't legal, I stammered, looking between them. You can't just throw me out without notice. I have rights. Actually, I spoke with my attorney this morning, Ethan replied, his voice clipped and businesslike. Since I'm the sole owner of the property, I can ask you to leave immediately. But our life together, 12 years, Ethan. Tears were streaming down my face now. How can you throw that away? How long has this been going on? Vanessa laughed, a light tinkling sound that made my skin crawl. Oh, honey, longer than you'd want to know. She twirled a strand of blonde hair around her finger. Ethan and I have a connection you couldn't possibly understand. I turned to Ethan, searching for any sign of the man I'd married. The man who had promised to love me forever, who had held me when my mother died, who had once talked about having children together. But his eyes were cold, distant. I think, it's best if you don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, he said, checking his watch. You should go now. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice breaking. That's not really my problem anymore, Ethan replied. Then, with a dismissive wave, you can stay with that friend of yours, Melissa, right? I stood frozen, unable to believe this was happening. Vanessa walked over to the refrigerator, my refrigerator, and helped herself to a bottle of the expensive white wine Ethan and I had been saving for our anniversary next month. Do you need help with your bag? She asked with mock concern, pouring herself a glass. Something inside me snapped. Don't you dare touch my things, either of you. I grabbed the duffel bag and stormed toward our bedroom, or what had been our bedroom until about 5 minutes ago. Vanessa's perfume already hung in the air, her makeup scattered across my vanity. My dresser drawers were half empty, the contents presumably stuffed into the bag Ethan had packed. Numbly, I gathered a few more essentials: the photo album of my parents, my grandmother's jewelry box, my laptop. As I moved around the room, I spotted signs of Vanessa's presence everywhere. An unfamiliar hairbrush, designer shoes kicked off by the bed, a lacy bra hanging over the chair where I used to sit and read every night. When I returned to the living room, Ethan and Vanessa were cuddled on the couch, our couch, scrolling through something on his phone. They looked up as I entered, Vanessa's lips curving into a triumphant smile. All set? Ethan asked impatiently. I stared at him, at the stranger who had replaced my husband. How could you do this? I whispered. After everything we've been through, together? People change, Sarah, he replied coolly. I've outgrown this marriage. I need someone who understands my ambitions, who can keep up with my lifestyle. Someone younger, you mean? I said bitterly. Vanessa smirked. I prefer the term more compatible. Ethan stood up and walked to the door, opening it pointedly. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce proceedings. Don't make this messier than it needs to be, and maybe we can work something out. Walked past him, clutching my hastily packed bag. As I stepped over the threshold of what had been my home for the last decade, I turned back one last time. You'll regret this, Ethan. He simply closed the door in my face. I stood on the front step, the evening breeze cutting through my thin blouse. The reality of my situation came crashing down all at once. I was homeless, suddenly single, and completely blindsided. My legs gave way, and I sank down onto the curb, the duffel bag at my feet. Cars drove past, neighbors returned home from work, sprinklers turned on across the street. The normal rhythm of the neighborhood continued while my world imploded. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands, scrolling to Melissa's number. She answered on the second ring. Hey girl, I was just thinking about you. There's this new Thai place we should try this weekend. Mel, I cut her off, my voice breaking. Ethan kicked me out. He's having an affair. I have nowhere to go. There was a beat of silence then. That absolute bastard. Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. 20 minutes later, Melissa's blue sedan pulled up to the curb. She jumped out and rushed over, wrapping me in a fierce hug before I could even stand up. I'm going to kill him, she muttered, grabbing my bag. Get in the car. You're staying with me as long as you need to. As we drove away, I couldn't help turning to look back at the house. Our dream home that we'd spent years saving for. Through the front window, I could see Ethan and Vanessa in the living room. He was pouring champagne. They were celebrating. I should have warned you, Melissa said, her hands tight on the steering wheel. I never trusted him, Sarah. There were rumors at the Christmas party last year, the way he was flirting with the interns. I didn't want to say anything without proof, but God, I should have. I stared out the window, watching my neighborhood recede in the distance. I gave him everything, Mel. 12 years. I supported him when he started his business. I was there, through every up and down, and he just replaced me. Like I was nothing. He's garbage, Melissa stated firmly. And you're going to get through this. We'll figure it out together. We drove in silence for a few minutes before Melissa spoke again, her voice gentler now. Do you want to stop somewhere? Get some food, maybe? I shook my head. Can we just drive by the house one more time? I left so quickly. I don't even know what else I need. Melissa hesitated, then nodded. Sure, but we're not stopping, okay? Just a drive-by. As we rounded the corner back onto my street, I saw that Ethan had turned on every light in the house. Through the large front window, I could see him and Vanessa dancing in the living room, champagne glasses in hand. He twirled her around, and her laughter seemed to float out into the night air. That bastard, Melissa whispered, slowing the car. I watched as Vanessa reached up and kissed my husband, the man who had promised to love me forever, while standing in my living room, drinking my champagne, planning her future in my home. Something shifted inside me in that moment. The shock and grief gave way to a different emotion. Determination. Cold, hard resolve. This isn't over, I said quietly. Melissa glanced at me, concern in her eyes. Sarah? No. I straightened in my seat, wiping away the last of my tears. He thinks he's won, that he can just throw me away and move on with his perfect new life. But he has no idea who he's dealing with. As we drove away from the house, my house, I made a silent vow. Ethan wouldn't get away with this. He had taken everything from me in a single night, but I would take it all back, and more. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. Drive, I told Melissa, my voice steadier now. I need to make some calls tomorrow. 3 days after Ethan threw me out of our home, I found myself sitting in the reception area of Wilson and Blackwood, nervously twisting the gold wedding band I still hadn't removed from my finger. My meeting with David Blackwood was my first real step toward fighting back. Sarah Miller, it's been too long. David's warm voice broke through my thoughts as he appeared in the doorway of his office. He was exactly as I remembered him. Silver-haired, with kind eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses and the reassuring presence that had made him my grandmother's trusted attorney for decades. I stood to shake his hand, grateful that he'd agreed to see me on such short notice. Thank you for making time, David. I really appreciate it. Anything for Eleanor's granddaughter, he said, ushering me into his office. Though I must say your message sounded urgent. What's going on? Once we were seated, I took a deep breath and told him everything. How Ethan had blindsided me with the divorce announcement, how he'd already moved his mistress into our home, how he'd claimed the house was solely his property and I had no right to stay. David listened intently, his expression darkening as my story unfolded. When I finished, he removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. I'm so sorry, Sarah. What Ethan did was cruel, no question about it. He put his glasses back on, but I have to ask, Why come to me instead of a divorce attorney? Family law isn't my specialty. Because you handled my grandmother's estate, I explained. And the house, our house, was purchased with money from my inheritance. I remember signing papers, but Ethan handled most of the details. He said it was simpler to put everything in his name for tax purposes. I shook my head at my own naivety. I trusted him completely. I see. David frowned. Let me pull up your grandmother's will and the estate disbursement records. For the next half hour, David typed away at his computer and rifled through old files, occasionally muttering to himself. I sat quietly, trying to temper my expectations. Even if I could prove I'd contributed to the house purchase, it would likely just mean I was entitled to some percentage in the divorce settlement. That wouldn't solve my immediate problem. I needed a place to live now, not months from now after lengthy legal proceedings. Well, this is certainly interesting, David said, finally, looking up from his screen with a small smile. Sarah, do you recall exactly how the house purchase was structured? I shook my head. Not really. I signed whatever Ethan put in front of me. I know that sounds irresponsible, but David held up a hand. No judgment here. Trust is the foundation of marriage. What matters now is moving forward. He spun his monitor around so I could see it. Look at this clause in your grandmother's will. I leaned forward, squinting at the legal language on the screen. In plain English, David explained. Your grandmother specified that any real estate purchased with your inheritance must remain solely in your name for at least 20 years after her death. She was quite insistent about this, actually. Wanted to ensure family properties couldn't be lost through marriage or divorce. But the house is in Ethan's name, I said, confused. At least that's what he told me. David's smile grew wider. That's what makes this interesting. I've pulled the original deed filing from the county records. Despite what Ethan may have told you, the house is legally registered only in your name, exactly as your grandmother stipulated. My guess is that the title company informed him of the requirement when you were closing on the property. I stared at him, trying to process this information. So, the house is mine? Legally mine? 100% yours, David confirmed. Ethan has absolutely no ownership claim whatsoever. A laugh escaped me, a shocked, disbelieving sound. He kicked me out of my own house? It appears so. David's expression turned serious, and that makes what he did not just morally wrong, but legally problematic as well. He had no right to evict you. But he told me he talked to his lawyer, who said, either his lawyer is incompetent or Ethan lied to you, David interjected. My guess is the latter. I suspect Ethan never bothered to check the actual paperwork. He probably just assumed the house was his. The magnitude of this revelation began to sink in. Ethan had thrown me out of a house that was legally mine, the home he was now sharing with Vanessa, the home where they were building their new life. Together, belonged entirely to me. For the first time since that terrible night, I felt a glimmer of power. What can I do? I asked, leaning forward in my chair. Well, legally speaking, you could return home immediately, David said. It's your property. You could even call the police to help you regain access if Ethan tries to prevent you from entering. The image of police officers escorting Ethan and Vanessa from my house flashed through my mind. It was tempting. So tempting. But then another thought occurred to me. What if I don't go back right away? I asked slowly. David raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean, Ethan doesn't know that I know the house is mine, right? He thinks he's in control. What if I let him keep thinking that for a little while? A small smile played at the corners of David's mouth. That would be entirely your prerogative. The house isn't going anywhere. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing with possibilities. How long could I legally wait before asserting my ownership? There's no time limit, David replied. The property is yours. You can reclaim it whenever you choose. For the first time, in days I smiled, a genuine smile that contained a hint of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. I think I need some time to plan my next move. David nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course. And when you're ready to act, I'll be here to help you through the legal process. As I left David's office an hour later, I felt like a different person than the broken woman who had walked in. The shock and grief were still there, but they had been joined by something else, a sense of purpose, of justice waiting to be served. I sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at the copy of the property deed David had given me. My name, Sarah Elizabeth Miller, was listed as the sole owner. Not Ethan, not both of us, just me. For the first time since that horrible night, I laughed, truly laughed. The sound filled the car, surprising even me with its force and clarity. Ethan had made a fatal mistake. In his arrogance, he'd never bothered to check whose name was actually on the deed. All those years of controlling our finances, of handling the complicated stuff because he claimed I wouldn't understand it, and now his oversight would be his undoing. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Melissa's number. "How did it go?" she answered immediately. "The house is mine," I said, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "Legally, 100% mine. Ethan has no claim to it at all." "Holy shit," Melissa's voice rose with excitement. "So you can go back? You can kick him out?" "I could," I confirmed, "but I'm not going to. Not yet." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said slowly, "that Ethan doesn't know the house is mine, and I'm not going to tell him. Not until I'm ready." "And when will that be?" Thought about Ethan and Vanessa dancing in my living room, celebrating their victory over me. I thought about 12 years of marriage ended in a 5-minute conversation. I thought about being tossed aside like I was nothing. "When it will hurt him the most," I answered. That evening I found myself parked a block away from my house, watching as Ethan's car pulled into the driveway. Vanessa was with him, laughing at something he said as they walked to the front door, his arm around her waist. They looked happy, carefree, like a couple who had gotten everything they wanted. I should have felt sadness seeing them together, but instead, a strange calm had settled over me. They were living in a fantasy world, one that I could shatter with a single document. The house. They were making plans in, the future they were building. It was all built on quicksand. As I watched them disappear inside, I made a decision. I wouldn't just take back my house when the time came. I would take everything. The next morning, I began my research. While Ethan thought I was licking my wounds and figuring out how to move on, I was meticulously documenting every aspect of our financial lives. Bank statements, investment accounts, credit card bills. I reviewed it all. What I found was illuminating. Over the past year, Ethan had been slowly moving money from our joint accounts into accounts I didn't have access to. He'd been planning this for months, carefully positioning himself for the split while keeping me in the dark. But he'd made mistakes. Several of them. Expensive dinners charged to our shared credit card on nights he claimed to be working late. Hotel charges in the city when he was supposedly on business trips out of state. A jewelry purchase from Tiffany's that I'd never received. The paper trail of his affair with Vanessa was obvious once I knew to look for it. And with each discovery, my resolve strengthened. I dug deeper, looking into his business dealings as well. Ethan ran a successful real estate development company, though. He'd always been vague about the details with me. "It's complicated," he'd say whenever I asked questions. "Nothing you need to worry about." But now I worried. I worried a lot. With a little help from Melissa, who worked in finance and knew how to find public records of business transactions, I uncovered a pattern of questionable deals and unpaid loans. Ethan had been cutting corners, making promises he couldn't keep, leaving a trail of angry investors and contractors in his wake. "He's been playing fast and loose for years," Melissa said as we reviewed the documents spread across her dining room table. "It looks like he's been using new investments to pay off old debts. That's practically a Ponzi scheme." "Why hasn't anyone called him out?" I asked. "Charm mostly," Melissa replied. "Plus, he's been lucky so far. The market's been going up, so he's managed to stay one step ahead of disaster. But if anyone started looking closely," she whistled, "he'd be in serious trouble." I gathered the papers into a neat stack, an idea forming. Then maybe someone should start looking closely. The next day, I opened a new bank account in my name only and transferred the remaining balance from our joint savings account, a modest sum that Ethan hadn't yet managed to siphon away. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I also called our credit card companies and removed myself as an authorized user on the accounts Ethan had opened. Let him pay his own bills from now on. As I drove past the house again that evening, a habit I couldn't seem to break, I saw Ethan outside, talking animatedly, on his phone. Even from a distance I could tell he was agitated. Later that night Melissa's phone rang. She answered it on speaker so I could hear. "Hello? Melissa, it's Ethan. Is Sarah with you?" She's not answering her phone. Melissa shot me a look. I shook, my head vigorously. "Why do you care, Ethan?" Melissa replied coldly. "You made it pretty clear she's not your concern anymore when you threw her out." "Look, I know you think I'm the bad guy here," he said, his voice tight. "But I need to talk to Sarah about our accounts. She's made some changes that what? Inconvenienced you? Made your life with your little girlfriend slightly less comfortable?" Melissa's voice dripped with disdain. "Sarah doesn't want to talk to you. Go through her lawyer from now on." She hung up before he could respond. "Sounds like he noticed," I said with a small smile. "Good," Melissa replied. "Let him squirm." The following week, I hired a private investigator to keep tabs on Ethan's movements. It was expensive, but worth it to know exactly what he was up to. The PI reported back regularly, Ethan's daily routines, who he met with, where he went after work, and as I suspected, Vanessa wasn't the only woman in his life. There were lunch meetings with a redhead from his office, late-night drinks with a brunette who worked at the bank that financed many of his projects. Ethan was keeping his options open, it seemed. Knowledge was power, and I was accumulating both. By the end of the second week after Ethan had thrown me out, I had compiled a detailed dossier on his business dealings, his affairs, and his finances. I knew more about Ethan's life now than I had when we were married, and what I knew could destroy him. Sitting in Melissa's spare bedroom that had become my temporary home, I spread out all my research on the bed and allowed myself to smile. "Let's play," I whispered to myself, feeling stronger than I had in years. The game was just beginning, and Ethan had no idea he'd already lost. 3 weeks into my stay at Melissa's apartment, I was ready to set my plan in motion. My research on Ethan's affairs and finances had given me a clear picture of his vulnerabilities, but I needed more. I needed inside information that only one person could provide. "Vanessa, are you sure about this?" Melissa asked as she helped me choose an outfit for my first strategic encounter. "What if she recognizes you?" I slipped into a floral sundress I'd never worn around Ethan. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." The Golden Lotus Spa was Vanessa's Friday afternoon ritual, information I'd gleaned from the private investigator's reports. Every week, like clockwork, she treated herself to a massage and facial using Ethan's credit card. My credit card, technically. I booked myself a massage for the same time slot and arrived early, settling into the relaxation lounge with a magazine and a cup of herbal tea. When Vanessa walked in, I kept my face partially hidden behind my magazine, watching as she checked in and was escorted to a changing room. Timing was everything. I waited until she emerged in a plush spa robe and then positioned myself directly in her path to the massage rooms. The collision was perfect, gentle enough not to spill our tea but firm enough to create a moment of connection. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I exclaimed, stepping back with just the right amount of embarrassment. Vanessa looked up, her eyes widening slightly as recognition dawned. "Sarah." I allowed my expression to shift from apologetic to surprised. "Vanessa? What a coincidence." She eyed me warily, clearly trying to gauge my intentions. I knew what she saw, a woman who had been discarded, who should be bitter and angry. I made sure to seem neither. "I didn't know you came here," she said cautiously. I smiled, the picture of calm acceptance. I needed some self-care. Been a stressful few weeks, as you can imagine. Something like guilt flickered across her face. Good. I could work with guilt. Listen, Sarah, about what happened. It's fine, I interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. These things happen. Marriages end. Life goes on. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows rose in surprise. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. That's very mature of you, she said slowly. I shrugged. What's the point in dwelling? Ethan and I had been growing apart for years. I just didn't see it until it was right in front of me. I gave her a knowing look. The massage attendant appeared, informing us our therapists were ready. As we walked down the hallway together, Vanessa seemed to relax, perhaps deciding I wasn't a threat after all. I was worried you'd hate me, she admitted. I don't hate you, I replied truthfully. I didn't hate her. She was just a pawn in my game. If anything, you did me a favor, showed me who Ethan really is. She nodded, a little too eagerly. He can be difficult sometimes. Oh? Trouble in paradise already? I kept my tone light, conversational. Vanessa hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Can I be honest with you? Of course. Ethan isn't always forthcoming. About anything, really. She lowered her voice. Did you know he has 3 different credit cards I'm not supposed to know about? I found the statements hidden in his desk. I widened my eyes in feigned surprise. That sounds like Ethan, always keeping secrets. And he's been getting these strange calls, she continued, warming to her subject. He always steps outside to take them. When I ask, he says it's business, but you don't believe him, I finished for her. She shook her head. I thought once you were gone, things would be different, that he'd be more open with me. I laughed, the sound genuine. Ethan? Open? Oh, honey. The massage attendant interrupted, directing Vanessa to her room. Before she went in, I touched her arm. We should grab coffee sometime, I suggested. I could tell you a lot about the man you're living with. Might save you some heartache down the road. She hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that. As she disappeared into her massage room, I smiled to myself. Phase 1. Complete. Seeds of doubt planted. The following Monday, I made another strategic move. I had David draft a letter to Ethan's bank, informing them that as the legal owner of our home, I was removing Ethan's access to the home equity line of credit he'd established. This will get his attention, David warned as I signed the paperwork in his office. I'm counting on it, I replied. Sure enough, my phone rang that evening. Ethan's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened with satisfaction to his angry message. Sarah, what the hell do you think you're doing? The bank called about the HELOC. You can't just... He paused, lowering his voice. Look, call me back. We need to talk about this. You're being irrational. I deleted the message, without responding. The next day, I met with 3 of Ethan's former business partners, men he'd pushed out of deals when they became inconvenient. I presented myself as the concerned soon-to-be ex-wife, innocently seeking advice about some troubling business documents I'd found among our papers. I'm not very good with financial matters, I said, playing the role of the naive spouse Ethan always treated me as. But these loan agreements don't look right to me. Brian Waters, a silver-haired developer who'd once been Ethan's mentor, examined the papers with a deepening frown. Where did you get these? They were in our home office, I replied. Not technically a lie. They were in my home office, among the files the PI had recovered. Sarah, Brian said seriously, these documents show Ethan has been misrepresenting his assets to secure loans. That's fraud. I widened my eyes. Fraud? Are you sure? The 3 men exchanged glances. We had our suspicions, another partner. Jack admitted. It's why we distanced ourselves from his projects, but this is concrete evidence. Oh my goodness, I gasped. What should I do? Protect yourself, Brian advised firmly. Make sure you're not tied to any of these deals. And, he hesitated, you might want to share these with the appropriate authorities. I bit my lip, the picture of a conflicted wife. I couldn't do that to Ethan. Not yet, anyway. But maybe I should keep copies just in case. They nodded in agreement, completely taken in by my performance. By the time I left, I had 3 powerful allies who believed they were protecting me from Ethan's misdeeds, when in fact, they were simply pawns in my larger strategy. That evening, I met Vanessa for coffee as planned. She'd been surprisingly eager, texting me within hours of our spa encounter. "Things are weird at home," she confided, stirring her latte nervously. "Ethan's been on edge all week, snapping at me for no reason, staying out late." "Let me guess," I said, leaning forward. "It started right after he got a call from the bank?" Her eyes widened. "How did you know?" I shrugged, taking a sip of my coffee. "I know Ethan, and I know there's a lot he hasn't told you." "Like what?" she asked, her voice suddenly small. For the next hour, I carefully fed her information. Not enough to send her running immediately, but enough to plant deep, flourishing seeds of doubt. I hinted at other women, at financial troubles, at a pattern of behavior I'd witnessed throughout our marriage. "He always trades up," I told her. "Newer, younger, it's his pattern. I wasn't his first wife, you know." "What?" Vanessa looked genuinely shocked. "He was married briefly in his 20s. He doesn't talk about it because she left him, for his best friend. It's why he has such rigid ideas about loyalty." I shook my head sadly. The irony, right? By the time we parted ways, Vanessa was looking at her phone differently, checking it more frequently, a new wariness in her eyes. Phase 2, complete. Doubt transformed into suspicion. The following week, while Ethan was at a 3-day business conference in Chicago with his red-headed colleague, according to my PI, I made my next move. I hired a locksmith to change all the security codes and locks on my house. "Shouldn't you inform the other resident?" the locksmith asked as he reprogrammed the security system. "My husband knows," I lied smoothly. "It's a surprise for our anniversary. We've been having some minor security concerns." Once the locksmith left, I walked through my home for the first time in weeks. Vanessa's presence was everywhere. Her clothes in my closet, her toiletries in my bathroom, her tacky decorative pillows on my sofa. But underneath, it was still my house. My grandmother's antique mirror still hung in the entryway. The dining table where Ethan had announced our divorce still bore the scratch from when we'd moved in 12 years ago. I ran my fingers along the familiar surfaces, reclaiming them inch by inch. I didn't take anything, didn't move anything. Not yet. But I took photos of every room, documenting the life Ethan and Vanessa had built in my absence. Evidence, ammunition, power. As I prepared to leave, I paused in the entryway and left a single item on the hall table, my old key to the house. It wouldn't work anymore, but Ethan wouldn't know that until he tried to use it. A message in plain sight. I had been here. The final piece of my preparation phase came the next day. Using a series of anonymous email accounts, I sent carefully selected financial documents to 2 of Ethan's biggest competitors and one very determined IRS auditor who had been investigating real estate fraud in our county. I didn't make any specific allegations. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves, raising just enough questions to prompt further inquiry. The seeds of destruction were now planted in fertile soil, ready to bloom when the time was right. That evening, I sat on Melissa's balcony, sipping a glass of wine and watching the sunset. My phone pinged with a text from Vanessa. "You were right." Found messages on his laptop, not just one woman, many. What should I do? I smiled to myself before responding. "Meet me tomorrow. I have a proposal." Everything was falling into place. Ethan would return from his business trip in 2 days, completely unaware that his carefully constructed world was balanced on the edge of a cliff. And I was about to give it a push. The cafe where I agreed to meet Vanessa was deliberately public, a place where she'd feel safe, but also where she couldn't make a scene. I arrived early, selecting a table in the corner with a clear view of the entrance. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. The confident, smug woman who had smirked at me from my own living room was gone. This Vanessa looked shaken. Her Hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes puffy from crying, her designer outfit replaced by jeans and a simple t-shirt. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. I pushed a cup of coffee toward her. "You look like you could use this." She took it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the mug as if seeking comfort from its warmth. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "Everything you hinted at, it's all true. Maybe worse." "Tell me," I said, keeping my voice gentle, understanding. She pulled out Ethan's laptop, his personal one, not his work computer. "I found this hidden in the trunk of his car, locked in a briefcase. I don't know what I thought, but I finally figured out the password. Let me guess," I said. "Lexus 2010? Her eyes widened. "How did you know?" "His first car. He uses it for everything he thinks is important." I smiled ruefully. Some things never change. Vanessa opened the laptop and turned it toward me. "Look at these messages. Look at how many women he's been seeing. Some of them go back months before you were even gone." I pretended to examine the emails with shock, though none of this was news to me. The private investigator had already uncovered most of these connections. "This one," Vanessa said, pointing to a thread with a woman named Caitlin. "She works at his office. They've been sleeping together for months. And here," she scrolled to another conversation. "This woman is a client's wife. Can you believe that?" "Unfortunately, yes," I replied, feigning sadness. "Ethan has always had wandering tendencies." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. "I feel so stupid. I thought I was special. I thought what we had was real." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We all did at some point. That's how he operates." She wiped away a tear. "There's more. I found financial documents too. Emails from investors demanding their money back, threatening legal action. One of them mentioned fraud." I nodded slowly. "Ethan's business isn't as successful as he pretends. He's been operating on smoke and mirrors for years. Why didn't you tell me all this before?" I gave her a knowing look. "Would you have believed me, or would you have thought I was just a bitter ex trying to sabotage your relationship?" She looked down, acknowledging the truth of my words. "What am I supposed to do now?" "I gave up my apartment to move in with him. I quit my job because he said he'd take care of me. This was the opening I'd been waiting for. What if I told you there was a way to protect yourself and get back at him at the same time?" Vanessa looked up, a spark of interest breaking through her misery. "What do you mean?" "Ethan betrayed both of us," I said carefully. "He's been lying to everyone. You, me, his business partners, probably the IRS. He deserves consequences for that." "What kind of consequences?" I leaned forward. "I have a plan, but I need someone on the inside, someone with access to his current movements and plans." "You want me to spy on him?" she asked, not sounding entirely opposed to the idea. "I want us to work together," I clarified, "to make sure Ethan faces the music for what he's done to both of us, and incidentally to make sure you don't go down with him when his financial house of cards collapses." She sat back, considering. "What exactly would I have to do?" "Keep me informed about his schedule. Let me know when he'll be away from the house. And most importantly, don't let on that anything has changed. Pretend everything is normal." "For how long?" "Not long," I promised. "A week, maybe 2. Just until everything is in place." Vanessa took a deep breath, then straightened her shoulders. "What's in it for me?" I smiled. This was the Vanessa I remembered. Calculating, self-interested. "Financial security. I'll make sure you come out of this with enough money to start over, and the satisfaction of seeing the look on Ethan's face when he realizes he's lost everything." She considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'm in. What's the plan?" I spent the next hour outlining enough of my strategy to secure her cooperation without revealing everything. Vanessa, it turned out, was eager to be helpful once she realized what Ethan had been doing. "He's planning a weekend getaway next month," she told me as we were finishing our coffee. 3 days at his friend Mark's lake house to reconnect. After I confronted him about working too much, she rolled her eyes. Now I know why he's been so busy. This is perfect, I said, unable to keep the satisfaction from my voice. That gives us exactly the window we need. As Vanessa and I parted ways outside the cafe, she paused. Why are you doing this, Sarah? You could have just taken him to court, exposed him that way. I considered my answer carefully. Because Ethan doesn't just deserve to lose a court case, he deserves to lose everything, just like he thought I did. She nodded, a new respect in her eyes. I'll text you when I know more details about the trip. That evening, I called David to set the final legal pieces in motion. I want to file the eviction notice, I told him, but I don't want it served until I give the word. Are you sure about this? David asked. It's been nearly a month. You could have been back in your home this entire time. I'm sure, I said firmly. This isn't just about the house anymore. This is about justice. The following days saw a flurry of activity. Vanessa proved to be a valuable ally, providing detailed information about Ethan's movements and plans. When he announced he needed to take a business trip to Phoenix, she immediately texted me the dates. He's leaving Thursday morning, back Friday night, her message read. But get this, I overheard him on the phone. He's not going to Phoenix. He's meeting someone named Diane in a hotel downtown. I forwarded this information to my PI, who confirmed that Diane was the brunette from the bank, the one approving Ethan's questionable loans. Interesting timing, I mused to Melissa over dinner. Just as his financial issues are coming to a head, he's spending private time with his loan officer. You don't think that he's sleeping with her to keep his loans from being called in? I wouldn't put it past him. While Ethan was busy shoring up his crumbling financial empire, I was systematically dismantling it from the shadows. Anonymous tips to regulatory bodies, carefully leaked documents to competitors, strategic conversations with his increasingly nervous investors. By the time Ethan returned from his Phoenix trip, 3 of his major financial backers had quietly pulled their support from his newest development project. The first domino had fallen. He was on the phone all weekend, Vanessa reported during our next meeting, shouting at people, making threats. I pretended to be asleep, but I could hear everything from the bedroom. Did he mention names? I asked. She nodded. Morgan and Kessler said they were breaking the terms of their agreement, that he'd sue them. I smiled. Morgan and Kessler were 2 of the investors I'd contacted. How did he seem otherwise? Stressed. Drinking more than usual. Vanessa hesitated. And I think he might be planning to propose to me. I nearly choked on my coffee. What? I found a ring in his desk drawer, and he's been talking about making things more permanent. This was unexpected, but not necessarily a problem. When? He mentioned wanting to take me away next weekend. The lake house trip I told you about. Said he has something special planned. I nodded slowly, the final pieces of my plan falling into place. Perfect. That's exactly when we'll make our move. Are you going to tell me what our move actually is? Vanessa asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. Not everything, I admitted. It's safer for you that way, but I can tell you this. By the time Ethan returns from that trip, his life as he knows it will be over. Vanessa studied me for a moment. You know, when we first met, I thought you were pathetic. The sad, boring wife Ethan had outgrown. And now? A slow smile spread across her face. Now I think you might be the most dangerous woman I've ever met. I returned her smile. Ethan made the same mistake. He won't make it again. As Vanessa left our meeting, I felt a strange surge of almost friendship toward her. She was still the woman who had helped destroy my marriage, still the smug homewrecker who had grinned as I was thrown out of my own house. But she was also a victim of Ethan's manipulation, another woman he had used and would eventually discard. In another life, under different circumstances, perhaps we might even have been friends. But in this reality, she was simply a means to an end, a necessary ally in my campaign for justice. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Papers ready. Say the word. I looked at the calendar on my phone. Ethan's lake house trip was exactly 1 week away. The perfect time to strike. Stand by, I texted back. D-Day is next Friday. I took a deep breath, anticipation building inside me. After weeks of careful planning, of gathering information and setting traps, the countdown to Ethan's downfall had officially begun. 7 days until justice. 7 days until I reclaimed everything he had taken from me. And more. 7 days until Ethan learned exactly who he had crossed. Friday morning arrived with a sense of destiny. I woke before my alarm, a calm certainty flowing through me. Today was the day Ethan's carefully constructed life would begin to unravel. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Melissa asked as she handed me a cup of coffee. She'd taken the day off work to support me. True friendship in action. "I've never been more ready for anything," I replied, checking my phone. A text from Vanessa confirmed that Ethan had packed his bags last night. He planned to leave for the lake house at noon, expecting her to join him after her hair appointment. At 3, he's taking the Mercedes, she wrote. Left the Audi for me to drive up later. Ring is definitely in his luggage. I checked. I smiled at her thoroughness. Vanessa had proven to be an unexpectedly valuable ally. Over the past week, she had provided detailed information about Ethan's schedule, his financial concerns, and even photographed key documents from his home office. At precisely 12:15 p.m., Vanessa texted again. "Eagle has left the nest, looking smug. Told me to pack something special for dinner." I immediately called David. "It's time." By 1 p.m., David and I were seated in his office with a bailiff and notary. I signed the official eviction notice, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and vindication as my pen moved across the paper. "Remember," David cautioned, "you have every legal right to do this, but changing the locks while he's away could escalate tensions when he returns." "I'm counting on it," I replied. At 2:00 p.m., Melissa and I arrived at my house, with a moving crew and the locksmith I'd hired previously. The locksmith quickly changed the remaining locks while the movers stood by, waiting for instructions. I unlocked the front door, feeling a strange sense of coming home and entering enemy territory simultaneously. Vanessa had cleared out her personal belongings that morning. As we'd arranged, the house looked almost normal, except for Ethan's touches, his golf trophies on the shelf, his expensive whiskey on the bar cart, his pretentious modern art on the walls. "Where do we start?" Melissa asked, looking around. I handed her a clipboard with a detailed inventory. "His clothes first. Everything goes into storage. I have the unit number and address here. Then his personal items. Everything gets documented before it leaves the house. What about the furniture? Anything we bought together stays. Anything he brought into the marriage goes to storage." For the next several hours, the house buzzed with activity. Movers carried out Ethan's designer suits, his golf clubs, his collection of expensive watches. Everything was photographed, cataloged, and carefully packed. I wasn't stealing or destroying his belongings. I was simply removing them from my property and placing them in a secure storage unit in his name, legally unassailable. By 5 p.m., the house had been transformed. Every trace of Ethan's presence had been systematically erased. I walked through each room, noting the spaces where his things had been, now filled with mine. The heavy, masculine furniture he'd insisted on had been replaced with pieces that had been in storage. My grandmother's antique desk, the comfortable armchair I'd loved and he'd hated. "The utilities are next," I said to Melissa as we surveyed our work. While the movers finished loading the last of Ethan's belongings, I made a series of phone calls. First to the electric company, then the water, then the cable and internet providers. One by one, I removed Ethan's name from the accounts and transferred everything solely to mine. "What about his phone?" Melissa asked. "Already taken care of," I replied. "I called the provider this morning. Since the account was originally in my name, Ethan just added himself later. I was able to remove his line. His phone will stop working sometime tonight." At 6 p.m., as dusk was falling, the final piece arrived. A security team I'd hired to monitor the property for the weekend. They would ensure Ethan couldn't force his way in when he discovered what had happened. "One last thing," I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out a large manila envelope. Inside was the dossier I'd compiled on Ethan's affairs, both his romantic indiscretions and his financial ones. I had made copies for his business partners, his investors, and key journalists at the business section of our local paper. Melissa watched as I sealed these envelopes, each addressed to someone who held power over some aspect of Ethan's life. "Are you sure about this part?" she asked. "The house, the eviction, that's all legally yours. But this is justice," I finished for her. "He didn't just take my home, Mel. He took my dignity, my security, my trust. He planned for months to discard me like I was nothing." I ran my fingers over the sealed envelopes. "These are the consequences of his choices." At 7:00 p.m., I sent the final text to Vanessa. "It's done. Your part is complete. Never contact Ethan again if you want to stay clear of what's coming." Her reply came quickly. "Already gone. Good luck." As the security team took their positions and the last of the movers departed, Melissa and I stood in the kitchen, my kitchen, where just weeks ago Ethan had callously ended our marriage. "How does it feel?" she asked, uncorking a bottle of champagne she'd brought for the occasion. I looked around at the transformed space. "Like reclaiming my life." We toasted with expensive crystal glasses, my grandmother's, not Ethan's. The champagne tasted like victory. At 9 p.m., right on schedule, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I knew who it was before I answered. "Hello, Ethan." "Sarah." His voice was tight with controlled fury. "What the hell is going on? Vanessa never showed up, and now my key doesn't work. The alarm code's changed." "Of course it is," I replied calmly. "I changed everything. It's my house after all." There was a moment of stunned silence then. "What are you talking about? The house is in my name." "Actually, it's not," I said, savoring each word. "It never was. Check the deed, Ethan. My grandmother's will specified that any property purchased with my inheritance had to remain solely in my name. You never owned this house. You just lived in it. My house. My rules." "That's impossible," he sputtered. "I would have known." "Would you? You always said I shouldn't worry my pretty little head about paperwork, that you'd handle the complicated stuff." I laughed softly. "Well, I've been handling things myself lately. Your belongings are in a storage unit. I'll have David send you the details. Don't try to come back here. The security team has instructions not to let you in, and I've filed a formal eviction notice." "You can't do this," he hissed, his voice rising. "I'll fight you, You'll what?" I interrupted. "Take me to court with money you don't have? Because I know about the loans, Ethan, the failed investments, the money you've been moving between accounts to stay afloat. I know everything." Another silence, longer this time. "Where's Vanessa?" he finally asked, his voice smaller. "Gone," I said simply. "She found out about the others, Caitlin from your office, Diane from the bank. She knows you were planning to propose just to keep her from asking questions about your finances. She's smarter than you gave her credit for. You turned her against me. It wasn't a question. No, Ethan. You did that yourself. I just helped her see the truth, the same truth I was too blind to see for years." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Justice," I replied. "And I've already got it." "Good night, Ethan. Don't bother calling again. I won't answer." I ended the call and turned to Melissa, who had been listening with wide eyes. "And now we wait," I said. The next morning, I awoke in my own bed for the first time in weeks. Sunlight streamed through the windows. I'd removed the heavy drapes Ethan had insisted on, and the house felt peaceful, cleansed. My phone buzzed with a text from the security team. Subject attempted to enter at 7:45 a.m., was informed of trespassing. Laws and left without incident. Appears to have slept in his car. I smiled. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 began at precisely 9:00 a.m., when my carefully prepared envelopes would be delivered to their recipients. By noon, Ethan's business partners would know about his financial improprieties. By evening, the story would begin to spread through the business community. At 10:30 a.m., my phone rang with Ethan's number again. I declined the call, but the voicemail he left was telling. Sarah, please. We need to talk about this. My cards aren't working. Something's wrong with my accounts. Just call me back. I deleted the message without replying. By evening, Ethan had called 17 times. I ignored every attempt. Instead, I focused on restoring my home to the way I wanted it, removing every trace of the life Ethan and Vanessa had briefly built, in my absence. As I was arranging my books back on the shelves, Ethan had packed them away to make room for his sports memorabilia. My phone buzzed with a news alert. I'd set up notifications for any mention of Ethan's name or his company in the local business press. The headline made me pause. Miller Development under investigation for potential fraud. Phase 2 was progressing exactly as planned. Sunday morning. Brought 5 more missed calls from Ethan and one from an unknown number that turned out to be his mother. I declined that one too. She had always taken his side, even when presented with evidence of his wrongdoing. Instead, I spent the day completing my reclamation of the house. By evening, it was as if Ethan had never lived there. His presence had been erased, room by room, leaving only my taste, my style, my life. As I sat on the patio, watching the sunset with a glass of wine, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Monday would bring the final phase of my plan, the complete and public unraveling of Ethan's carefully constructed facade, and I would be there to witness every moment of his downfall. Monday dawned bright and clear. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that projected both confidence and authority, the outfit of a woman in control of her life. Today was the day Ethan would finally confront the full consequences of his actions. I had arranged to meet with David at his office to sign the final paperwork formalizing my financial separation from Ethan. As I drove downtown, my phone began to buzz incessantly. Ethan again. This time I decided to answer. "What is it, Ethan?" I asked coolly. "What have you done?" His voice was ragged, desperate. "My investors are pulling out. The bank has frozen my business accounts. The Journal is running a story about irregularities in my company finances. This is your doing, isn't it?" I simply shared the truth, Ethan. The same truth you've been hiding for years. "You're destroying everything I've built." "No," I corrected him. "You destroyed it yourself, with every shortcut you took, every lie you told, every person you betrayed. I'm just making sure you face the consequences." "I need to see you," he said, his tone shifting to something almost pleading. "We need to talk face to face, please, Sarah." I considered for a moment. This confrontation was inevitable, and perhaps necessary for true closure. "Fine. My house, 7 o'clock tonight." "Your house?" he repeated, bitterness creeping back into his voice. "My house," I confirmed. 7 o'clock. Come alone, or don't come at all." I ended the call and continued to David's office, a sense of calm purpose guiding my actions. Everything was proceeding exactly as I had planned. By late afternoon, the story about Ethan's company had expanded. 3 of his major investors had publicly withdrawn their support. His business partner had issued a statement distancing himself from Ethan's individual actions. The carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing, piece by piece. At 6:30 p.m., I positioned myself in the living room with a glass of wine. I had instructed the security team to allow Ethan onto the property, but not into the house unless I specifically invited him. I wanted him to experience the humiliation of standing on the doorstep of the home that had never truly been his. At 6:55 p.m., right on time, a car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, I watched Ethan emerge. He looked disheveled, his normally immaculate suit wrinkled, his hair uncombed. He approached the front door with the confidence of a man who still believed he could charm his way out of any situation. The doorbell rang. I took a deep breath and moved to answer it, my heart surprisingly steady. "Hello, Ethan," I said as I opened the door, blocking the entrance with my body. He tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Sarah, can I come in? We need to talk." "No," I replied simply. "We can talk right here." His smile faltered. "On the doorstep? Like I'm some kind of salesman?" "Like you're a visitor to my home," I corrected. Which is what you are now. His jaw tightened. This is ridiculous. I lived here for years. My name is on... Your name isn't on anything. I cut him off. Not the deed, not the mortgage, not the utility bills, not any more. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration radiating from him. Fine. Have it your way. But we need to talk about what you've done. My company is falling apart. My reputation... Your reputation reflects who you truly are now, I interrupted. A man who lies, cheats, and manipulates everyone around him. Is that what this is about, Vanessa? He leaned closer, lowering his voice to the persuasive tone he'd used so often during our marriage. Sarah, I made a mistake. I see that now. But destroying my business, my life, isn't that going too far for revenge over an affair? I laughed, the sound sharp in the evening air. This isn't just about Vanessa, Ethan. This is about 12 years of lies. This is about you planning for months to discard me. This is about you throwing me out of my own house and moving your mistress in before my side of the bed was even cold. His expression darkened. Where is she? What did you say to her? I told her the truth, about the other women, about your financial problems, about the fact that you were only proposing to keep her compliant while you continued your affairs. I smiled thinly. She made her own decisions after that. You had no right. I had every right, I shot back. You brought her into my home. You made her part of this. Before Ethan could respond, a car pulled up to the curb, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. Vanessa stepped out, but she wasn't alone. A tall, blonde man in an expensive suit emerged from the driver's side. Perfect timing, I said. Ethan turned, his face going slack with shock as he recognized Vanessa. What's going on? Who is that? Vanessa approached, the man at her side. Hello, Ethan, she said coolly. This is Andrew. He's with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We've been having some very interesting conversations about your business practices. Ethan's face drained, of color. You're working with the FBI? What have you told them? Andrew stepped forward, his expression professionally neutral. Mr. Miller, we have some questions about certain discrepancies in your company's financial records, specifically regarding the Westlake Development Project and several investor accounts. This is insane, Ethan sputtered, looking between us. I haven't done anything illegal. The evidence suggests otherwise, Andrew replied. We have documentation indicating systematic misrepresentation of assets, misappropriation of investor funds, and tax evasion. What evidence? What documentation? Ethan's voice rose in panic. Vanessa smiled. You really should have been more careful about what you kept on your laptop, Ethan, and you definitely shouldn't have given me your passwords. I watched as the realization dawned on Ethan's face. He had been outplayed completely. His arrogance, his assumption that the women in his life were too naive or too desperate to challenge him, had been his undoing. We'd like you to come with us to answer some questions, Andrew said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. I want my lawyer, Ethan said weakly. That's your right, Andrew acknowledged. You can call him from the office. As Andrew led Ethan toward the waiting car, Vanessa lingered behind. She turned to me, an unreadable expression on her face. Did you know? She asked quietly. About the FBI? I shook my head. Not specifically. I knew his business dealings wouldn't withstand scrutiny, but I didn't know how far it would go. She nodded slowly. They approached me after I started asking questions about his finances. Turns out I wasn't the first girlfriend to get suspicious. A rueful smile crossed her face. I just happened to be the one with access to his files. Will you testify against him? I asked. Already have, she replied. Immunity deal. I was never officially part of the business, just collateral damage. She paused, then extended her hand to me. I know we'll never be friends, but thank you for opening my eyes before it was too late. I took her hand briefly. Take care of yourself, Vanessa. You too, Sarah. I watched as she walked back to the car, slipping into the back seat opposite Ethan. As the sedan pulled away, I caught a final glimpse of Ethan's face through the window. Shocked, furious, defeated. Far. Perfect expression for a man who had lost everything. As the car disappeared around the corner, my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "Is it done?" "It's done," I replied. I closed my front door and leaned against it, a complex mix of emotions washing over me. Relief, satisfaction, a touch of sadness for what might have been, but mostly an overwhelming sense of justice served. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a fresh glass of wine, raising it in a silent toast to my grandmother. Her foresight in protecting my inheritance had given me the foundation for this moment of reclamation. My phone buzzed again, a news alert. Ethan's face appeared on the screen beside the headline, "Local developer questioned in fraud investigation." I placed the phone face down on the counter. Tomorrow there would be more headlines, more revelations, more consequences for Ethan to face. But tonight was about savoring this victory, not just the reclaiming of my house, but the reclaiming of my power. As I moved through the rooms of my home, truly mine now in every sense, I felt lighter with each step. The ghost of my marriage, of Ethan's betrayal, was finally being exorcised. In the master bedroom, I opened the windows wide, letting the evening breeze purify the space. On the nightstand, a single photograph remained, not of Ethan and me, but of my parents on their wedding day, smiling with the kind of genuine love I now realized had always been missing from my marriage. "To new beginnings," I whispered to the empty room. Outside, the neighborhood settled into the peaceful rhythm of early evening. Inside, I was finally home. The morning after Ethan was taken in for questioning, I woke to a flurry of notifications on my phone. Ethan's face was splashed across the local news websites, his name now synonymous with financial scandal. "Miller Development CEO detained in fraud investigation," screamed the headlines. Beneath them, smaller but equally damning, "Investors scramble as Miller empire crumbles." I scrolled through the articles as I sipped my morning coffee, seated at my kitchen island. My kitchen, my home, reclaimed in full. According to the reports, Ethan had been released on bail around 3 a.m. after a grueling 8-hour interrogation. No formal charges had been filed yet, but sources close to the investigation indicated they were imminent. My phone rang, David's name flashing on the screen. "Have you seen the news?" he asked without preamble. "I have," I replied. "Is there anything I need to be concerned about?" "Not legally, no. You've been careful to stay within the bounds of the law." He paused. "But Ethan's going to be desperate. Cornered animals are unpredictable, Sarah." "I'm safe," I assured him. "The security team is still in place." "Good. Keep them for at least another week, and call me immediately if he contacts you." I'd barely ended the call when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Ethan. New phone. We need to talk. Please. It's important." I stared at the message. Of course he had a new phone. I'd removed his line from our shared plan. I considered blocking this number too, but curiosity won out. What more could he possibly have to say? 10 minutes later, another text. "Sarah, I know you're reading these. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just 10 minutes of your time." 5 minutes after that. "They're going to charge me. My lawyer says it looks bad. I need your help." I laughed out loud at that one. My help? After what he'd done? The audacity was almost impressive. Instead of responding, I busied myself with practical matters, calling my old boss to discuss returning to work, arranging for the locksmith to come back and install additional security features, meeting with a financial advisor to reorganize my investments now that they were completely separate from Ethan's toxic business dealings. By evening, Ethan had sent 17 increasingly desperate texts. I ignored them all. The following morning, as I was preparing for a job interview, my phone rang with the unknown number. This time, I decided to answer. "What do you want, Ethan?" My voice was cool, detached. "Thank God," he breathed, sounding genuinely relieved. "Sarah, I need to see you. Today." Why would I agree to that? Because he hesitated. Because despite everything, we were married for 12 years. That has to count for something. It might have, if you hadn't thrown me out of my own house for a younger model. I kept my tone even, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing emotion in my voice. I made a mistake. A terrible, unforgivable mistake. His voice cracked. I'm not asking you to take me back. I just need help. Why would I help you? Because they're going to arrest me tomorrow, he said quietly. Grand jury indictment, wire fraud, securities fraud, tax evasion. My lawyer says I'm looking at 15 years minimum. I absorbed this information silently, feeling strangely empty. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just emptiness. I'm sorry to hear that, I said finally, surprising myself with the sincerity in my voice. But I don't see how I can help. You could tell them I wasn't the only one making financial decisions. That you were involved in the business too. I nearly dropped the phone. Excuse me? Just blur the lines a little. Create reasonable doubt. If you say you were part of the decision-making process, you want me to lie to federal investigators? To implicate myself in your crimes? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything you've done, you're asking me to go to prison for you? Not for me, he said quickly. For us. For the life we built together. There is no us, Ethan. You ended that when you chose Vanessa. She's cooperating with them, he said bitterly, telling them everything. Things that aren't even true. Like what? I asked, genuinely curious about what lies he thought Vanessa was telling. She's saying I knew the Westlake properties were overvalued, that I deliberately misrepresented the investment potential. And did you? His silence was answer enough. Goodbye, Ethan. Wait. His voice rose with panic. Just meet with me once, please. If you ever love me at all, give me this one thing. I should have hung up. I should have blocked his number and moved on with my life. But something, curiosity perhaps, or the ghostly remnant of 12 years of marriage made me agree. Fine, one meeting. Tomorrow noon at Riverside Park, the public bench area near the fountain. 30 minutes, no more. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you, Sarah. I ended the call, already questioning my decision. But perhaps this final confrontation was necessary. The last scene in a play that needed to reach its conclusion before the curtain could fall. That night I received a call from an unknown number. Thinking it might be Ethan again, I answered cautiously. Hello? Mrs. Miller? The voice was female, professional. This is Officer Jenkins from the county jail. I have an inmate attempting to place a call to this number. Ethan Miller. Will you accept? I gripped the phone tighter. What happened? I'm not at liberty to discuss that, ma'am. Will you accept the call? I hesitated only briefly. Yes. There was a click, and then Ethan's voice came through, strained, hollow. Sarah, I need help. What happened to tomorrow's meeting? I asked. That's not happening now. He sounded exhausted. They accelerated the timeline, arrested me tonight at my hotel. My assets are frozen. I can't even afford bail. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. What do you want me to do, Ethan? Call Thomas Blackwell. He's a lawyer, specializes in financial crimes. Tell him I need him. Please. He paused. I have no one else to call. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had discarded me so callously was now completely alone, reaching out to me as his only lifeline. I'll call him, I said finally. Thank you, he whispered. Sarah, Don't. I cut him off. Don't say anything else. After hanging up, I sat in silence for several minutes, processing what had just happened. Then I picked up my phone again and looked up Thomas Blackwell's number. I made the call, explained the situation briefly, and provided Ethan's information. My obligation fulfilled, I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped outside onto my patio. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. I thought about Ethan sitting in a cell, finally facing the consequences of his actions. I had expected to feel triumph, but instead found only a quiet sense of closure. The next morning brought news that Ethan had been formally charged with 8 counts of fraud and 3 counts of tax evasion. His bail had been set at $2 million, money he no longer had access to. He would remain in custody until trial. I received a text from Vanessa. "Have you seen the news?" "I have," I replied. "Are you okay?" she asked, surprising me with her concern. "I'm fine," I wrote back. "You?" "Getting there. Moving to Chicago next week. Fresh start." "Good luck," I responded, meaning it. The conversation felt like the closing of a chapter. 2 women bound together by the actions of a man who had betrayed them both, now moving on to separate lives. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. The security guard called to inform me that Ethan's mother, Patricia, was at the gate, requesting to see me. Patricia Miller had never approved of me. Throughout our marriage, she had made subtle digs about my background, my career choices, my apparent inability to provide her son with grandchildren. Now, as she stood on my doorstep, looking smaller and older than I remembered, I felt an odd mixture of pity and vindication. "Patricia," I greeted her, not inviting her in. "What can I do for you?" Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "May I come in, Sarah? Please." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She looked around the foyer, noting the changes I'd made, the removal of Ethan's imposing artwork, the return of my grandmother's antique mirror. "You've been redecorating," she observed stiffly. "Restoring," I corrected. "Would you like some tea?" She nodded, following me to the kitchen in silence. As I prepared the tea, she sat at the island, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I suppose you're pleased with yourself," she said finally. Seeing Ethan brought so low, I set the cup in front of her, meeting her gaze directly. "I didn't cause Ethan's current situation, Patricia. His own choices did that. You could have handled the divorce privately. Instead, you've destroyed his reputation, his business, everything he's worked for." "Ethan destroyed those things himself," I replied calmly. "I simply refused to continue being his victim." Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup. "He's asked me to talk to you, to see if you'll help." "By falsely implicating myself in his crimes?" "No." "By showing mercy," she countered. "By acknowledging that 12 years of marriage should count for something. It counted for nothing. To Ethan when he threw me out of my own house." She looked away, unable to defend that point. "He's my only child, Sarah." "And you raised him to believe he could do whatever he wanted without consequences," I said, not unkindly. "That's not love, Patricia. That's enablement." Her chin lifted defiantly. "You never understood our family." "Perhaps not, but I understand justice." I took a sip of my tea. "Is there anything else?" She set down her cup, mostly untouched. He's asked for some personal items, photographs, his father's watch, sentimental things." I nodded slowly. "I can arrange that. Have his lawyer contact mine with a specific list." As she rose to leave, Patricia paused. "He did love you, you know. In his way." "His way wasn't enough," I replied simply. After she left, I sat alone in the kitchen reflecting on our conversation. It struck me that Ethan had sent his mother to fight his battles. Even now, he was trying to manipulate others into solving his problems. Some things never changed. Over the next week, the story of Ethan's downfall dominated local business news. Former partners distanced themselves, claiming they'd had concerns about his methods for years. Investors filed civil suits, seeking to recover what they could of their money. His company's assets were seized, projects halted mid-construction. Through David, I arranged for Ethan to receive the personal items he'd requested: family photographs, his father's watch, the cufflinks. His grandfather had given him. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was humanity, something Ethan hadn't shown me in the end. 10 days after his arrest, I received a handwritten letter from the county jail. Ethan's once confident handwriting now looked shaky, uncertain. Sarah, it began. By the time you read this, I'll have accepted a plea deal. 15 years, possibility of parole after 8. My lawyer says it's the best outcome possible given the evidence against me. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to read this letter all the way through. But I need to say that you were right. About everything. I took you for granted. I treated you like an accessory to my life rather than a partner in it. And when I decided I wanted something different, I discarded you without a second thought, confident that I held all the power. I was wrong. You were always stronger than I gave you credit for. Smarter, too. I underestimated you completely, and that was my downfall. I'm not asking for sympathy. I made my choices, and now I'm facing the consequences. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away. Too late, but I understand. Take care of yourself, Sarah. Build the life you deserve. The one I was too selfish to build with you. Ethan. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Not to treasure, but to close. A final artifact from a chapter of my life that was now officially ended. The following day, the news reported that Ethan Miller had accepted a plea deal. He would serve 15 years for multiple counts of fraud. The man who had once been the rising star of our city's business community was now inmate Duranchak 247891 at the State Correctional Facility. As I drove past the jail on my way to a job interview, I allowed myself one brief moment of reflection. The man inside those walls had once been the center of my world, my husband, my partner, the person I'd planned to grow old with. Now he was a stranger, a cautionary tale, a footnote in my personal history. I drove on, focusing on the road ahead, literally and figuratively. Ethan's story was ending. Mine was just beginning. 3 months after Ethan's sentencing, I stood in my living room, surveying the transformation. New paint in warm, welcoming colors. New furniture arranged for conversation rather than impression. Art that I loved, not pieces chosen for their investment value or status. It looks amazing, Melissa said, arriving with a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Completely different. That's the idea, I replied, taking the bottle. Out with the old, in with the new. Tonight was my housewarming party, a celebration of reclamation, of new beginnings. I'd invited friends who had stood by me through the turmoil, colleagues from my new job at an architectural firm, neighbors who had tactfully avoided gossiping about the drama they'd witnessed unfolding on our street. Notably absent was anyone from my former life with Ethan. I'd made a clean break, shedding the social connections that had been based on his status rather than genuine friendship. As I popped the champagne cork, Melissa raised her glass. To new beginnings. And old friends who stuck around for them, I added, clinking my glass against hers. The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the first guests. The next few hours passed in a blur of conversation, laughter, and warmth. People moved through my home, admiring the changes, offering congratulations on my new job, carefully avoiding direct mentions of Ethan or the scandal. Mid-evening, as I was refilling the appetizer trays, the doorbell rang again. I opened it to find a tall man with kind eyes and a slightly hesitant smile. "Hi," he said. "I'm Daniel Taylor, Melissa's colleague. She invited me. But if this isn't a good time..." "Of course," I replied, stepping back to welcome him. "Come in. Any friend of Melissa's is welcome here." Daniel entered, handing me a small potted plant. "Housewarming gift. It's a peace lily. Supposedly they're impossible to kill, which is good because I heard you've been through enough stress without worrying about plant murder." The comment was so unexpected and delivered with such a charmingly self-deprecating smile that I laughed out loud. "Thank you. I'll try not to add plant slaughter to my resume." As the evening progressed, I found myself gravitating toward Daniel. He was an architect at Melissa's firm, thoughtful and articulate with a dry wit that made me laugh more than I had in months. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers, a refreshing change from the performative conversations that had dominated my social life with Ethan. When most of the guests had departed, Daniel lingered, helping me and Melissa clean up. "You didn't have to stay. I told him as he gathered empty glasses from the patio. I wanted to, he replied simply. Besides, it's the least I can do after eating half of those amazing stuffed mushrooms. It was only a third at most, I countered, smiling. After everything was tidied away, Melissa made a show of checking her watch. Oh, would you look at the time? I should get going. Daniel, would you mind walking Sarah's new neighbor Jackie home? She mentioned she's nervous about walking alone at night. Before either of us could respond, Melissa had whisked away the elderly woman who lived 3 doors down, leaving Daniel and me alone in the kitchen. Subtle, isn't she? Daniel said with a wry smile. About as subtle as a bulldozer, I agreed. I'm sorry about that. You don't have to stay. Actually, he said, I was hoping to ask you something before I left. He hesitated, then continued. I have tickets to the symphony next Friday. Their new season is opening with Beethoven's Ninth. I was wondering if you might want to join me. I felt a flutter of something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Interest, anticipation, possibility, but also hesitation. I should probably tell you, I said carefully, that I'm not really looking for complications right now. My life has been complicated enough recently. Daniel nodded. I've heard some of it. Office gossip. He met my eyes. But I'm not asking for complications, just company for an evening of good music. No pressure, no expectations. I studied him for a moment, this man who seemed genuinely interested in me. Not as an accessory, not as a trophy, but as a person. I'd like that, I said finally. Thank you. After he left, I stood on my front porch, watching as headlights illuminated the quiet street. In the distance, I could just make out a lone figure standing under a streetlight, Ethan's brother, Mark, who had been watching the house all evening. He hadn't approached, hadn't tried to speak to me, had simply observed from afar, a final reconnaissance for a battle already lost. As our eyes met across the distance, I raised my hand in a small gesture. Not a wave of welcome, but an acknowledgement of his presence. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The following week brought another milestone, the final sale of Ethan's company assets. As the legal owner of our home, I'd been spared the financial devastation that typically accompanies white-collar crime. But Ethan's business empire had been dismantled piece by piece to repay investors and satisfy court judgments. It was a strange feeling, watching the business he'd been so proud of, the achievement he'd often valued above our marriage, reduced to liquidation notices and bankruptcy filings. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that justice had been served. Friday evening arrived with unexpected nerves. I hadn't been on a first date in over 12 years. As I dressed for the symphony, I found myself second-guessing everything: my outfit, my hairstyle, my decision to accept the invitation in the first place. Stop it, I told my reflection firmly. This is just an evening out, nothing more. Daniel arrived exactly on time, looking handsome in a charcoal suit. His appreciative smile when I opened the door calmed my nerves somewhat. You look beautiful, he said simply. Thank you. I grabbed my wrap and evening bag. Shall we? The symphony was magnificent. Beethoven's Ninth performed with passion and precision. I lost myself in the music, in the soaring final movement that always brought tears to my eyes. When I glanced at Daniel during the Ode to Joy, I caught him watching me, a gentle smile on his face. After the performance, we walked to a small wine bar nearby, where the conversation flowed easily. He told me about his childhood in a small town upstate, his passion for sustainable architecture, his rescue dog named Einstein. I shared stories of my own, carefully edited to minimize mentions of Ethan, but honest nonetheless. You know, Daniel said as we were finishing our wine, I've heard bits and pieces about what happened with your ex-husband. Office gossip is impossible to avoid. I tensed slightly. And I think you're remarkable, he continued. Not for the revenge, though that was pretty impressive from what I've heard, but for the strength it must have taken to rebuild afterward. I'm still rebuilding, I admitted. Aren't we all in some way? He smiled, then added, no pressure. but I'd like to see you again. Maybe dinner next week? I considered his offer, this opportunity to step further into my new life. I'd like that, I said finally. As Daniel drove me home, I noticed a familiar car parked down the street from my house, Ethan's mother's sedan, another observer from my past unable to move on. Daniel noticed my distraction. Everything okay? Fine, I replied, making a decision. Just realized I left something at the office. Would you mind driving past my house? I'll get it tomorrow. He nodded, continuing down the street without stopping. As we passed Patricia's car, I kept my gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge her presence. She was part of the past. Tonight was about the future. The following morning, I woke with a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in months. After coffee on the patio, I decided it was time for one final act of closure. In the guest room closet, a single box remained, containing the last of Ethan's personal items that I'd removed from the house. Photos of us together, cards he'd given me over the years, the wedding album I'd once treasured. I carried the box to the backyard and set it down beside the fire pit. One by one, I removed the items, examining each briefly before placing it in the pit. The photos, the cards, the small mementos of a life that no longer existed, all turned to ash. When I reached the wedding album, I hesitated. Then, deliberately, I removed a single photo, not of Ethan and me, but of my parents at our reception, their faces alight with joy and love. They had shown me what a true partnership looked like, even if I'd failed to find it in my own marriage. I slipped this photo into my pocket, then added the album to the flames. As the fire consumed these artifacts of my past, I felt no regret, no sadness, only a profound sense of release. The smoke rose toward the clear blue sky, carrying with it the last physical reminders of the life I had shared with Ethan. That evening, I received a text from Daniel. Had a wonderful time last night. Dinner Tuesday at 7? I know a great Italian place. I smiled as I typed my reply, looking forward to it. Later, standing on my patio with a glass of wine, I watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Somewhere across the city, in a prison cell, Ethan was beginning his 15-year sentence. Somewhere else, Vanessa was starting her new life in Chicago, and Patricia was likely still driving past my house, clinging to the ghost of her son's former life. But here, in this moment, I was focused only on the present, on the home I had reclaimed, the career I was rebuilding, the possibilities that stretched before me like an open road. From inside the house, my phone rang. Melissa, calling, to get the details about my evening with Daniel. Life continuing, friendships enduring, new connections forming. I took one last look at the sunset before turning to go inside. The past was behind me now, reduced to ash and memory. The future, bright with promise, awaited. As I stepped through the doorway into my home, my sanctuary, my victory, I whispered a final farewell to the woman I had been, and a greeting to the woman I was becoming. Welcome home, Sarah. Was it justice, or was it vengeance? Perhaps in the end, the difference matters less than finally being free. If you enjoyed Sarah's journey from betrayal to reclamation, please like and subscribe for more stories of redemption, revenge, and new beginnings. What would you have done in her shoes?